I thought I was the one exposing the rot within my precinct, but I didn't realize until it was too late that I was just the final piece of evidence they needed to disappear. My partner had been feeding them my every move, and now the entire department is coming to finish what they started. The sun was relentless that afternoon, baking the asphalt of the downtown plaza until the air shimmered with waves of distortion. I stood on the periphery, watching Officer Miller. He was the kind of cop who wore his badge like a crown rather than a responsibility, his posture perpetually tilted toward aggression. He was leaning against his cruiser, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt, eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's predatory boredom. Then he saw her. Maya was sitting on a stone bench, holding a cardboard sign and a water bottle, just trying to find a patch of shade. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't blocking traffic, and she certainly wasn't breaking any laws. But Miller had a reputation for maintaining order in ways that only seemed to apply to those who couldn't fight back. He sauntered over to her, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete. I watched from behind the dark glass of my car, my pulse beginning to thrum with a familiar sick dread. I saw him lean down, his face a mask of patronizing amusement. He said something that made her flinch. When she stood up to walk away, he didn't just stop her. He reached for the high-pressure hose attached to the municipal fountain nearby, a tool meant for maintenance, not for human beings. With a flick of his wrist and a twisted, jagged grin, he doused her. He didn't just spray her, he pursued her, laughing as the freezing, high-pressure water knocked her back, soaking her clothes and sending her belongings skittering across the wet pavement. The crowd gasped. A few people pulled out their phones, but Miller simply tipped his cap to them, his expression daring anyone to intervene. He was enjoying the spectacle, the raw power trip of watching a woman struggle to stay upright while he treated her like a piece of refuse to be washed off the sidewalk. It was a calculated act of humiliation, designed to remind everyone within eyeshot exactly who owned the streets. When he finally cut the water, Maya was shivering, her face pale, her eyes burning with a mixture of terror and white-hot fury. Miller stood over her, casually adjusting his belt. "Move along," he barked, his voice echoing in the sudden silence of the plaza, "before I decide you're resisting a lawful order and add a much more serious charge to your record." I gripped my steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My blood was boiling, but I knew better than to jump out. Not yet. I was a junior detective in the same precinct, a man who had spent 3 years biting his tongue and taking notes while men like Miller turned the law into their personal weapon. I had been waiting for a moment like this, a moment so undeniably cruel, so public, that the thin veil of brotherhood would finally be torn away. I watched as Maya, with a trembling hand, reached down to pick up her bag. As she did, she looked directly into Miller's eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just held his gaze with a cold, terrifying intensity that actually made Miller step back. He looked momentarily rattled, his bravado slipping for a fraction of a second, before he laughed it off and turned back to his cruiser, oblivious to the fact that his life, the one he thought he'd protected with his badge, was already crumbling. I started my car and pulled away slowly, trailing him. I had the dashcam footage from a dozen angles, including the hidden camera I'd installed in my own car weeks ago. But that wasn't even the best part. I knew things about Miller that the department had worked tirelessly to bury. I knew about the organized scheme he was running behind the scenes, the way he'd been planting illegal weapons in innocent people's homes to meet his arrest quotas, and the terrifying evidence he'd been hiding regarding packets of substances that had suddenly vanished from the evidence locker. He thought he was invincible. He thought the blue line would hold forever, shielding him from the consequences of his sadistic games. He didn't know that the internal security audit I'd been conducting under the cover of darkness had finally reached the desk of the only person in the precinct who couldn't be bought. As Miller pulled into a secluded parking garage, clearly intending to meet one of his partners, I pulled my phone out. I wasn't going to go to the captain. I was going higher. I hit the send button on the encrypted file, watching the progress bar crawl toward completion. By the time he walked out of that garage, he wouldn't be a cop anymore. He'd be a target. But as I watched him step out of his cruiser and reach into his trunk, my heart stopped. He wasn't reaching for his radio. He pulled out a heavy, black bag, one I recognized from the case files of a high-profile investigation that had been marked closed years ago. He looked around, his eyes narrowing as if he felt someone watching. He started walking toward a dark sedan parked in the shadows of the third floor. I realized then that I had miscalculated. He wasn't just a dirty cop. He was the primary player in a game so dangerous that if he caught me now, I wouldn't just lose my career. I wouldn't make it home to tell the truth at all. The heavy sound of a door slamming shut echoed through the garage, and I saw a silhouette step out to meet him. Someone I recognized from the most restricted files in the station. My phone buzzed in my lap. It was a message from the Internal Security Office. Stop the transmission. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The message on my screen flickered like a warning flare in the dark. Stop the transmission. My thumbs hovered over the keypad, my mind racing at 100 miles an hour. Who was monitoring my personal secure line? Was it the chief himself? Or had Miller's web of corruption infected the very department that was supposed to act as our moral compass? I looked back toward the concrete shadows of the parking garage. Miller was handing the black bag to a man in an expensive charcoal suit. The way the man moved, with a measured, predatory grace, told me he wasn't just some street-level thug. He was connected to the internal security check that had been quietly investigating missing evidence for months. I realized then that my secret investigation hadn't been as secret as I'd thought. I had been walking into a trap set by people who played for stakes much higher than a mere promotion or a reputation. If I backed down now, Miller would continue his reign of terror, and Maya, the woman he'd humiliated for a cheap thrill, would be just another casualty of a system designed to crush the vulnerable. I couldn't let it go. I hit send on the encrypted file, watching the icon change from pending to transferred. The data was out. It was in the hands of the federal authorities, beyond the reach of the local network of corruption. I held my breath as I watched the man in the charcoal suit point toward my direction. He hadn't seen me yet, but he was staring at my level with an unnerving precision. My car was tinted, but in the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the garage, I was practically sitting in a spotlight. I shifted my car into reverse, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I needed to leave, to get to a safe house, to get to anyone who wasn't part of this decaying machine. But as I touched the gas, a second vehicle screeched to a halt, blocking the exit. It was a black SUV, unmarked, its high beams blinding me. Miller stepped into the light of the beams, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He didn't look like a cop anymore. He looked like a man who had realized the walls were closing in and had decided to burn the building down on his way out. He reached into his belt, but he didn't grab his radio. He drew his service weapon, holding it with the practiced ease of a man who had used it for things far worse than maintaining order. The man in the charcoal suit stayed back, watching, his hands clasped behind his back like he was observing a lab experiment. My phone erupted with a call. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered, my voice barely a whisper. "Who is this?" I demanded. "Detective." A voice crackled on the other end, cold and devoid of empathy. "You've just signed your own death warrant. That data didn't go to the feds. It went to a server owned by the very group you were trying to expose. You didn't just break the chain of command, you handed them a roadmap to every witness you were trying to protect. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every move I had made, every encrypted step I'd taken, had been intercepted and redirected. The Internal Security Office wasn't a watchdog. It was the gatekeeper for the organized scheme I was trying to dismantle. Miller walked toward my driver's side window, his grin widening as he saw the terror dawning on my face. He tapped his weapon against the glass, the sharp clink, clink, clink sounding like a death knell in the cavernous garage. "You really should have stayed in your lane, Detective," Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You thought you were the hero of this story, didn't you? You thought you were going to save the day and put us all behind bars for decades. But look around. You're in a private garage, in a city where the law is exactly what we say it is, and you're completely, utterly alone." He reached for the door handle. I knew I couldn't sit there and wait for the end. I stomped on the gas, the tires screaming against the slick concrete as I veered sharply to the left. narrowly missing a concrete pillar. The sudden movement sent Miller stumbling back, and for a split second, I had an opening. I surged toward the ramp, the engine roaring in protest. Behind me, I heard the sound of heavy gunfire, not warning shots, but aimed, professional fire. A bullet shattered my side mirror, sending shards of glass flying into the cabin. I drifted around the corner, my hands slick with sweat, heading for the exit ramp that led to the city streets. I didn't care about the speed limit or the lights. I just needed to reach the main road, to reach a place where there were witnesses. But as I crested the final incline of the ramp, I saw the exit blocked by 2 more patrol cruisers. They weren't there to stop the criminals. They were there to stop me. I hit the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the front bumper of the blockade. I looked in the rearview mirror. Miller was sprinting up the ramp, his weapon drawn, his face a portrait of absolute rage. Then, I looked at the cruisers in front of me. The officers inside weren't looking at me with concern or duty. They were looking at me with the same cold, empty gaze as the man in the charcoal suit. I was trapped between 2 fires. My phone buzzed again. A text message appeared, simple and chilling. The files were intercepted, but there's one copy you didn't know about, and now they're coming to finish what they started. Suddenly, the power in the entire garage went out, plunging us into total, suffocating darkness. In the silence, I heard the heavy, rhythmic click of a magazine being loaded into a weapon just outside my door. The sudden plunge into darkness was absolute, heavy enough to feel against my skin. The only sound in that cavernous tomb was the frantic, uneven rhythm of my own breathing, and the distant metallic click-clack of weapons being readied. I was a sitting duck in a metal cage, surrounded by people who were supposed to be the law, but were currently acting as judge, jury, and executioner. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of survival instinct. I didn't wait for them to find me. I lunged for the glove box, tearing it open to grab my flashlight and my backup sidearm, a piece I'd kept off the record for exactly this kind of nightmare. I rolled out of the car, hitting the cold, oil-stained concrete of the garage floor, just as a concentrated burst of light from a tactical flashlight pierced the gloom. The beam swept across the hood of my abandoned car, followed by the shattering of my windshield. They were tearing the vehicle apart, assuming I was still behind the wheel. I crawled, belly down, through the grease and shadows, toward the stairwell access door. My muscles ached, and my mind was fractured, trying to process the betrayal. The entire department, or at least the rot at its core, had been waiting for someone like me to play hero so they could snap the trap shut. I reached the heavy fire door and pushed, praying the hinges wouldn't groan. It swung open silently, and I slipped into the stairwell, my pulse thundering in my ears. I began to climb, 3 steps at a time, my lungs burning. Every floor was a gamble. If I went to the street level, I was walking into their blockade. If I went to the roof, I was cornered. But the stairwell itself was a labyrinth. I pulled out my phone one last time. There was no signal, a localized jammer. They were thorough. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut as I realized this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a systematic hunt. On the 5th floor, I stopped to listen. Boots hit the stairs below me, heavy, steady, rhythmic. They weren't rushing, they were tracking. I caught the unmistakable voice of Miller, his tone relaxed, almost jovial, as if he were out on a Sunday stroll. Check the vents, sweep the landings, he can't get past the perimeter. He thinks he's a whistleblower. He's just a loose end that needs to be tied off. I moved upward, my movements fluid and quiet. As I reached the 7th floor landing, I saw a flicker of movement through the reinforced glass window of the door. A shadow, tall, slender, and moving with a lethal grace, was heading for the roof. It wasn't Miller. It was the man in the charcoal suit, the one who held the real power. I realized then that Miller was just a dog on a leash, and if I wanted to survive, I had to cut the tether. I had to reach the rooftop, but not to flee. I had to confront the source. I burst onto the roof, the cool night air hitting me like a physical blow. The city skyline twinkled in the distance, a sprawling, indifferent expanse of light that felt 1,000 miles away. The man in the charcoal suit was standing at the edge, gazing out at the horizon, his back to me. He didn't turn around. He didn't even flinch when I leveled my weapon at him. "You're remarkably persistent, detective," he said, his voice calm, projecting across the wind. Most men in your position would have surrendered 10 minutes ago. But you're fueled by that quaint, outdated concept of justice. It's not a concept, I shouted, my voice straining against the wind, my hands steady despite the adrenaline. It's the law, and you've spent years turning it into a playground for your organized scheme. I've seen the files, I've seen the packets of substances, and I've seen what you do to people like Maya. He finally turned, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small encrypted tablet and held it up. The screen displayed a live feed, not of the garage but of my apartment. I saw my bookshelf, my desk, and then a figure walking through my living room. It was someone I knew, someone I trusted with my life. It was my partner, Sarah. She was holding a stack of files, the very evidence I thought I'd successfully uploaded to the feds. You see, detective, he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky register. You were so focused on exposing the corruption that you failed to realize that the corruption is the foundation. And people like Sarah? They aren't victims. They're the architects. You didn't come to me to stop the game. You came here to be the final piece of evidence we needed to disappear. My stomach turned to ice. Sarah. The one person who stood by me, who pushed me to take the case. She was working with them. She was the one who had tipped them off about my secret investigations all along. The roof access door behind me creaked open. Miller stepped out, a cruel smirk on his face, followed by 3 more men in tactical gear. I was surrounded, pinned between the edge of the building and a wall of corruption. But as the man in the charcoal suit began to walk toward me, he stopped short. His phone buzzed. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed as he looked at the screen. He looked up at me, then back at his phone, his face draining of color. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice losing its composure for the first time. The building beneath us suddenly vibrated, and the entire city skyline, every light, every skyscraper, every glowing advertisement, blinked out at once, leaving us in total, absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, a low, ominous siren began to wail from the streets below, and a voice over a megaphone echoed through the night. "This is a department-wide emergency. Secure the scene. No one leaves alive." The silence following the siren was more terrifying than the noise. The city, usually a hum of electricity and life, had turned into a tomb of shadows. On the rooftop the air grew static, charged, and heavy. Miller and his men were frozen, their tactical lights flickering erratically, as if something was interfering with their power supply. The man in the charcoal suit stared at his phone, his thumb tapping the screen with a frantic, uncharacteristic desperation. "You didn't just leak the files," he whispered, his voice no longer smooth, but ragged. "You triggered a wipe. You set a kill switch on our entire network." I didn't answer. I didn't even know what he was talking about. I had only tried to send a single folder to a contact at the State Bureau, but it seemed the emergency protocols I had stumbled upon were far more volatile than I'd ever imagined. My phone, dead for the last 20 minutes, suddenly illuminated with a single, glowing, red notification. Sync complete. Distributed to public ledger. The realization hit me. I hadn't just reported them to the authorities. I had exposed their entire organized scheme to the public domain. Every ledger, every bank account, every name. The information was now impossible to contain. The man in the charcoal suit lunged, not for me, but for the phone in my hand, his face a mask of primal fury. I sidestepped him, my training kicking in, and slammed the butt of my sidearm against his temple. He went down like a sack of stone. Miller let out a roar, his composure shattered, and leveled his illegal weapon at my chest. "You think this makes you a hero?" he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You've just signed your own death warrant. No one gets out of here tonight." Before he could fire, the stairwell door behind him exploded inward. It wasn't the police. It wasn't the department. It was a group of people, faces covered by masks, carrying heavy-duty cameras and streaming devices. They were the underground journalists, the ones I had spent months trying to track down, the ones who had been digging for years but could never get enough evidence to break the story. They hadn't come to rescue me. They had come to broadcast the collapse. Flashbulbs popped, turning the roof into a disorienting gallery of white light. Miller stumbled back, blinded by the sudden barrage of lenses. The journalists were everywhere, recording his face, his weapon, and his panicked attempt to hide his badge. They were shouting questions, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of accountability. "Officer Miller, is it true you run the precinct's black market? Is it true you use an illegal weapon to enforce your quotas?" The power dynamic shifted in a heartbeat. Miller, the man who had treated the plaza like his personal kingdom, was now reduced to a frantic animal, trapped in the light of 1,000 scrutiny-filled eyes. He looked at the men in tactical gear, but they were already backing away, trying to blend into the shadows. Their loyalty didn't extend to a sinking ship. I stood there, dazed, my weapon still drawn, watching as the man in the charcoal suit began to crawl toward the roof edge, trying to vanish into the dark. I moved to stop him, but I was intercepted by Sarah. She stepped out from behind a ventilation duct, her face unreadable. She wasn't holding a file or a weapon, she was holding a radio. "Don't do it, detective," she said, her voice eerily calm. "If you cross that line and finish this, there's no coming back. You'll be labeled as a rogue agent, a man who went off the deep end and murdered a city official. They'll erase the truth from the internet before the sun rises. Look at the live stream counts. It's already hitting millions of viewers. Let the public take him down. If you pull that trigger, you become the villain they want you to be." I looked at the journalists, then at the camera lenses, then at Miller, who was now frantically trying to cover his face with his jacket. Sarah was right. If I killed him here, in front of the world, I would justify every lie they had ever told about me. But as I started to lower my weapon, I noticed something in the background. A black sedan had pulled onto the rooftop. An impossible feat, yet there it was, idling near the helipad. The driver's side door opened, and a figure stepped out. It wasn't one of Miller's men. It was the woman I had seen earlier, the one Miller had hosed down in the plaza. She wasn't shivering anymore. She was holding a device I didn't recognize, and she looked directly at me with a smile that chilled my blood. She wasn't a victim, she was the architect. She pressed a button on the device, and the entire rooftop suddenly shivered. The structural steel beneath our feet groaned, and the perimeter lights flared to a blinding, lethal intensity. "You're all done playing now," she announced, her voice projected through a hidden speaker system that seemed to vibrate the very air. "You've served your purpose. The information is out, the reputation is ruined, and now the house is being cleared." The roof began to tilt. Not a metaphorical tilt. The entire building's foundation had been compromised. Explosions began to rumble from the floors below, rhythmic and precise. The journalist screamed as the roof started to slide toward the edge of the abyss. Sarah grabbed my arm, her mask of calm finally slipping. "Run!" she shrieked. But as I turned to look for an exit, the floor beneath me gave way, and I felt myself falling into the hollow, dark core of the building. My last sight was Miller and the woman staring down at me, their expressions merging into one of cold, calculated victory. As I plummeted into the blackness, my phone vibrated one final time with a message that read, "You didn't expose the crime, you just provided the excuse for the purge." The air whistled past my ears, a cacophony of groaning steel and structural collapse. I didn't hit the bottom. Instead, my fall ended with a jarring, bone-rattling thud against a heavy maintenance netting strung across the interior elevator shaft, a safety measure the building contractors had installed years ago but never removed. I lay there, gasping, my lungs burning, as the entire structure shuddered again. The explosions weren't random, they were precise, surgical strikes meant to bring the building down into a controlled pile of rubble, effectively burying the evidence and everyone trapped inside. I didn't have time to pray. I hauled myself onto a support beam, my hands raw and bleeding. Above me, the sky was a jagged hole of smoke and fire. I could hear the panicked shouts of the journalists and the distant rhythmic firing of illegal weapons. Miller was still up there, and the woman who had orchestrated the entire purge was likely already escaping via the helipad. I had to get out, but I couldn't leave with empty hands. I reached into my tactical vest, pulling out the small, hardened data drive I'd removed from the server earlier, the one Sarah had tried to intercept. This wasn't just a copy, it was the master key to the entire organized scheme. I scrambled up the service ladder, my movements driven by a primal, desperate need to survive. I broke through the fire door of the second floor, stumbling into a hallway filled with thick, choking smoke. I didn't head for the main lobby. I knew they'd be waiting there with their cleanup crews. Instead, I bypassed the main elevators and ran toward the basement storage level, where the old pneumatic mail tubes were still connected to the city's underground infrastructure. It was a relic of the past, but it was my only ticket to the outside world without being seen. I shoved the drive into the vacuum-sealed transport canister and sent it spiraling into the depths of the city's forgotten tunnels, programmed to surface at a prearranged dead-drop location that only the regional attorney, a woman known for her incorruptible, almost fanatical devotion to the truth, would recognize. I watched the canister disappear, feeling a weight lift from my chest. If I died here, the truth would still reach its destination. As I turned to flee toward the service exit, I ran straight into Sarah. She was standing there, holding a tablet, her face pale. She didn't have a weapon. She looked broken, like a mirror shattered into 1,000 jagged, painful pieces. "They didn't give me a choice," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They told me if I didn't help them, they'd erase my family, my kids, my husband. They were already being tracked." I looked at her. My partner, my friend, my betrayer. I didn't feel rage anymore, only a hollow, aching exhaustion. "Then go," I said, pointing toward the emergency stairwell that hadn't yet been rigged for demolition. "Take the back exit to the alley. If you ever want to wash this off, start by walking away and never looking back." She hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into the dark. I didn't have time to mourn the woman I thought I knew. I pushed through the service door, emerging into the biting cold of the alleyway, just as the building groaned one final time. A massive cloud of dust and debris erupted, masking my retreat as the structure folded in on itself, a monument to greed and corruption, turning into a heap of twisted rebar and broken concrete. I stood in the alley, watching the flames lick the sky, listening to the sirens of the actual emergency responders finally descending on the scene. I was covered in grit, my uniform ruined, a ghost in a city that had tried to swallow me whole. I checked my pulse, my breathing slowing to a steady, rhythmic pace. I was alive, and more importantly, the evidence was in the right hands. By morning, the city woke up to a firestorm. The drive I'd sent had triggered a cascade of arrests that reached from the patrol officers on the street to the high-ranking officials in the department. Miller was found in the rubble, alive but cornered, his career destroyed, and his criminal connections severed by the very people he thought he controlled. The woman who had orchestrated the purge disappeared, but her empire was dismantled brick by brick, her name dragged through the mud until she was nothing more than a cautionary tale. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I left my badge on the charred remains of the precinct steps. I walked away from the life of a detective, from the hollow promises of the Blue Line, and from the ghosts of the corruption I'd fought so hard to defeat. Maya, the woman in the plaza, wasn't just a victim. She became the voice of a new movement, leading the city into a dialogue about accountability that couldn't be silenced. I never saw Sarah again, though I heard rumors that she started a new life in a city thousands of miles away, under a different name. As for me, I live a quiet life now, far from the reach of those who think they can play God with the law. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I look at the news and see a story about a corrupt official finally facing justice, and I allow myself a small ghost of a smile. I didn't win the war, and I didn't end the corruption of the world, but I made sure that for once, the truth was louder than the sirens, and that, I realized as the sun set over my new horizon, was more than enough.